Section 12 of the Early Tudors by Charles Edward Moberly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 10. Domestic Affairs after the Peace with France, 1515 to 1518. Peace was now restored to England. The question was whether or no the government would restore national prosperity after the trials which it had sustained. The task was not hopeless, for though sorely burthened at home, our commerce had been extended abroad at the expense of Venice. Ships from London and Southampton having found their way to Sicily, Crete, Chios, and even to Tripoli and Beirut. English merchants had also been profitably employing vessels hired at Ragusa and other Mediterranean ports. Indeed, neither Henry nor his great minister Wolsey could be charged with general indifference to trade interests, for they founded the corporation of the Trinity House for the management of pilotage and lighthouses, spent not less than £65,000 on the pier at Dover, and improved the harbours of Hull, Southampton, Newcastle, Scarborough, and Calais. The inland communications of the country were also by degrees made better, and the navy yards and storehouses of Woolwich and Deptford founded. In order to increase trade with the Netherlands, Wolsey obtained a congress at Antwerp in 1515, where England was represented by Cuthbert Tunstall, Sir E. Poynings, and the young Thomas More, in the hope of replacing England on the footing of the intercursus malis described in Chapter 5. The Flemings strongly maintained that this had been a personal arrangement of the Archduke Philip's, and had fallen through with his death. To this the English replied that he had expressly agreed for his heirs after him, and that no other agreements had been substituted for it, and that no documents could be quoted to prove that it had ever stopped. From this subject the Congress passed to the discussion of grievances, Tunstall complaining that his countrymen had been forced to pay illegal tolls even when driven in by storms, and that embargoes were sometimes laid on their vessels for years, after which they had to pay anchor money for the time of detention. The quarrels on points like these rose so high that one of the commissioners was excommunicated in the Antwerp churches, and the others were calumniated frightfully. Fortunately for them, political circumstances just then made Charles's advisers more anxious than ever for an English alliance, and therefore all difficulties solved themselves. The question of the intercursus malis was adjourned for 5 years, but meantime it was to remain in force. As to other grievances, our merchants must have been hard to please if they were not satisfied. All English privileges were extended. They might choose their own brokers and porters. All legal remedies should be freely open to them. Their cases should take precedence of all others, and be always decided within 6 days. Quarrels of Englishmen among themselves were to be settled in their own consular courts, which should be supported by the magistrates in the case of resistance, and the factory at Antwerp was to remain theirs in full property. About this time a curious incident arose out of Henry's anxiety for the welfare of seaports. A Cornish member named Strode had promoted an Act of Parliament hindering Cornish mine owners from throwing rubbish into the rivers and thus forming bars below. He had overlooked the fact that the Cornish and Devonshire miners lived under a constitution of their own, holding a small district parliament under the warden of the stannaries, the enactments of which had the force of local laws. This body had passed an ordinance in 1510 that every one might dig for tin where he could find it, and carry the waters to his works according to old custom, all hinderers being liable to a fine of £40. This they proceeded coolly to inflict on Strode for his doings at Westminster, and as he would not pay, they threw him into irons in a damp dungeon, and fed him there for 3 weeks on bread and water. Fortunately he was wanted at the end of that time to do his duty as a collector of taxes, and a royal order set him free. But before he was released, his captors added insult to injury by making him give a bond of £100 for costs. The sentence and the bond were of course cancelled by Parliament, which also asserted that no one could be punished either for bringing or procuring a bill to be brought into Parliament, or for any opinion delivered in speaking to a motion. Nothing was at that time done to remedy the damage to the rivers, but 20 years later, when Plymouth, Falmouth, Dartmouth, Teignmouth, and Foy were all suffering from the same cause, and a ship of 100 tons could hardly get up where there had been water enough for one of 800, a law was passed forbidding the use for mining purposes of any river flowing into a harbour. Even in this it was thought necessary to guard by an express clause against Parliament being set at naught by the Court of Stannaries. In the latter part of the reign, parliamentary privileges were farther established by the decision of the judges in 1542 that the Commons had acted legally in setting free by their own authority, and without any legal process, Ferrers, the member for Plymouth, who had been imprisoned for debt by the city authorities. The quarrel was not settled until the sheriffs and all parties concerned in the arrest had been sent to prison, and the king himself had expressed strong approbation of the vigour displayed by the House of Commons in the maintenance of its time-honoured exemption. As our traders were anxious to sell their cloths by retail in as many Flemish towns as possible, it might be supposed that they would have been ready to admit the idea of reciprocity. But fairness in such claims is not always thought of where great interests are at stake, and our merchants were in point of fact not less anxious to keep foreigners' goods out of England than to sell their own elsewhere. Good reasons for restricting imports were of course ready. It was argued in the first place that foreigners made their profits by tempting people to buy fancies and trifles, such as England might well do without, and in the second, with doubtful consistency, that foreign competition was destroying all wholesome English trade. Dutchmen were bringing over timber ready cut, and leather ready manufactured, with nails, locks, baskets, cupboards, stools, tables, chests, girdles, saddles, and printed cloths. The merchant strangers, men querulously said, were importing silk, wine, oil, and iron, and moreover carrying away so much wool, tin, and lead that Englishmen can have no living. By thus taking imports and exports separately, and not as balancing one another, and by showing to their own satisfaction that England was parting with what she most wanted, in exchange either for superfluities or for what should be made by English hands, the grumblers raised the jealousy against foreigners to a white heat, and on May Day, 1517, it burst out with great violence through a protectionist sermon preached by Dr. John Bell at the Spital Church a few days before. Taking for his text Terram dedit filiis hominum, the orator proceeded to descant on the public grievances. The land, he said, was given to Englishmen, and as birds defend their nests, so ought Englishmen to cherish and defend themselves, and to hurt and grieve aliens for respect of their commonwealth. As it began to be rumoured that May Day would be chosen for an attack upon the Steelyard, which was the London centre of German trade, Wolsey took care to send for the Lord Mayor on April 30th, and commanded him by all means to preserve the peace. Accordingly, a meeting of the aldermen was held, and they were ordered to proclaim in their several wards that every house owner must stay at home and keep in all his household from 9 o'clock that evening till the same hour of the following morning. The announcement, however, produced in the notoriously turbulent ward of Cheap the very disturbance which it was intended to prevent. The cry of clubs was at once raised, and hundreds of apprentices came pouring from the precincts of St. Paul's. The rioters broke open the Compter and Newgate, and released some prisoners who had been committed in the last few days for attacks on foreigners. After this they proceeded, in defiance of the magistrates, to plunder private houses, especially those of strangers, the masters of which they announced their intention of beheading by Lynch law. In the midst of the tumult the lieutenant of the Tower actually opened fire upon the city from his batteries, creating immense terror, but doing little real damage. Not finding any foreigners at home, the mob began to disperse, but the last who retreated, to the number of 300, were intercepted and sent to prison. In order to strike more terror, the government prepared 10 movable gibbets, as if to execute the prisoners at all parts of the town. But whether from the influence of bribes judiciously applied, or from a certain sympathy with the rioters felt by men in power, the only person finally executed was a broker named Lincoln, by whose persuasion the unlucky sermon had been preached. The day was long remembered in London as the evil May Day, and it is said that the gaieties proper to the season were never again celebrated as freely as before this untoward event. That foreign trade after this was thought to require some restriction we may infer from the Act of 1525, which forbade alien merchants to take any foreigners as apprentices, or to have more than 2 foreign journeymen, a blow evidently aimed at the peculiar constitution of the German factory of the Steelyard in London, whose managers, with their employes, all foreigners alike, lived in a half monastic fashion within their fortified buildings, unmarried and avoiding connections with their neighbours. A still unkinder stroke was that the same Act placed every alien practising a handicraft in London under the search and reformation of the fellowship of his particular craft there. The population of England, which had been about 2,500,000 at the time of the poll tax of 1377, had now increased to about 3,500,000. Yet, curiously enough, there was a general impression that the number of people in the country was diminishing. It was evident that the larger corporate towns, such as Norwich, were getting less populous, there being obviously little inclination to rebuild decayed houses or to restore them after a fire. But the cause of this phenomenon quite escaped the notice of political thinkers. This was, in fact, the pressure of the guild regulations in the large borough towns, which people were glad to escape by living beyond their limits. Thus an employer might be comparatively free as to his mode and hours of working, the number of his apprentices and hands, and the wages which he paid. Accordingly, manufactures now spread themselves over several new districts. Among others, the towns of Birmingham and Manchester increased much at this time. As even accurate observers could not see the whole country at once, they were naturally misled by the appearance of decay in the older and more celebrated towns, and thought that the same process was going on everywhere. A far less imaginary depopulation of the country districts, such as the Utopia had lamented, had excited alarm as early as 1489, when it was remarked that the Isle of Wight, which, as being particularly exposed to French attack, required to be well peopled, was becoming desolate and not inhabited, but occupied by beasts and cattle. It was therefore enacted in that year that no one of any rank whatever should hold more than one farm there of the maximum value of £6 13s. 4d. a year, and that those who occupied several such should elect which they would retain, and their leases be void as regarded the remainder. This restored the population of the island, and enabled it, as Mr. Froude has remarked, to foil the French invasion of 1546. In the present reign the same principle was carried out more broadly by an Act of 1515, which ordered that if the holder of any estate in England destroyed farmhouses upon it, the superior lord should resume possession of half of it until they were rebuilt, and by another 20 years after, which gave the same power to the king if no immediate lord had exercised it. The change in the hands of new proprietors from customary to competition rents was also bitterly complained of. It produced, as Bishop Latimer shows in a well-known passage, a fatal change in the position of the smaller tenants. "My father," he says, "was a yeoman, and had no lands of his own, only he had a farm of 3 or 4 pounds by year, and hereupon tilled so much as kept half a dozen men. He had walk for 100 sheep, and my mother milked 30 kine. He was able, and did, find the king a harness with himself and his horse, until he came to the place where he should receive the king's wages. I can remember that I buckled this harness when he went into Blackheath Field. He kept me to school, or else I had not been able to have preached before the king's majesty now. He married my sisters with £5 or 20 nobles apiece. He kept hospitality for his poor neighbours, and some alms he gave to the poor. And all this he did off the said farm, where he that now hath it payeth £16 by year or more, and is not able to do anything for his prince, for himself, nor for his children, or give a cup of drink to the poor. This agrees with More's declaration in the Utopia that tenants were pilled and polled by their landlords, who not only drove off their tenants to make sheep walks, but constantly managed, either by fraud or violence, to make small freeholders sell their lands. And the trouble continued through Henry VIII's reign into that of his son, when the Protector Somerset's ill-planned endeavour to remedy it was one of the great causes of his fall. In the miserable state of Scotland after the Battle of Flodden, two courses had been open to Henry. He might either have ordered Surrey to advance and conquer the country once for all, or he might have answered Queen Margaret's appeal for brotherly help, and supported the infant king by all means in his power. Yet he took neither, but allowed his victorious army to be disbanded, and Scottish affairs to fall into hopeless confusion without interference. A Parliament was at once held at Edinburgh, which appointed Margaret regent and guardian of the king, but in August 1514 she forfeited all public confidence by marrying Lord Angus, who was considered as the head of the English party in Scotland, and a rebellion at once arose against her. Her opponents entreated Francis I to send over to their help the Duke of Albany, the son of a brother of James III, who had lived all his life in France and held the rank of Lord High Admiral there. Escaping with some difficulty from the English cruisers off St. Malo, Albany reached Dumbarton on May 1515 with a considerable train of Frenchmen, whom he proceeded to raise to positions of authority, thus exciting a jealousy second only to that against England. Yet he was appointed Protector till James V reached the age of 18, and at once besieged Stirling Castle in order to get possession of the royal children. All this time Lord Dacre, who commanded on the border, was trying various means to support the English interest in Scotland. He aided as strongly as possible the resistance to Albany, received all those who were exiled for rebelling against him, tried to carry off the princes by the help of Angus, and failing in this, at last persuaded Margaret herself to take refuge in England. The Queen escaped to Berwick in September 1515, and was immediately after this delivered of a fair young lady, afterwards well known as Lady Lennox, the mother of Henry Darnley, and considered nearer the English succession from having been born on our soil. Ill and miserable, Margaret was carried on men's shoulders to Morpeth, and soon heard that her husband and his partisans had been defeated by the Protector. Angus himself was sent prisoner to France, but he soon escaped to join his wife, and Henry was glad to welcome both as instruments for any future plan against Scotland. Meanwhile Albany was getting so weary of his position as regent that to escape from it he would, as he said, gladly have walked on foot all the way to London, and in 1516 he returned to France on business of his own, leaving French garrisons in the chief fortresses, but with little idea of returning at the time fixed. In 1517 the Treaty of Noyon allowed Margaret to return to Scotland, where she found that her friends had been put to death for favouring her escape, and that she would not be allowed to take any part in the administration. Great and various also were the Irish troubles at this time, though they did not burst into actual war. Only 5 half-counties were really under English law, and in these the vexations of the courts were compelling landowners to sell the smaller estates. The power of the colonists had been also weakened by a pestilence which had raged among them. by the death of several eminent leaders without heirs, and by their disuse of English weapons. The only possible remedy seemed to be to call for more colonists, if possible one from each parish in England, to civilize Irish chieftains perforce, by making them Lords of Parliament if they had 1,000 marks a year, and to induce them to send their sons to Dublin or Drogheda to be taught reading and writing with the English manners and language. But at this time Henry had not sufficient interest in their country to make him carry through reforms of such importance. Consequently things went from bad to worse, and the Reformation was soon to make every difficulty tenfold. In 1517 the Pope produced a fresh scheme for a crusade, as well he might, having himself been all but taken prisoner by a Turkish fleet which was sweeping the coast of Italy from Pisa to Terracina. The plan was as usual all too vast, including as it did the enlistment as allies of the Sophie of Persia, Prester John of the Indies, and the kings of Nubia, Ethiopia, and Georgia. It was hoped that by these strong measures it would be possible in 3 years, and at the cost of 12,000,000 ducats, to seize and fortify Mount Zion and several other points in Palestine, to invade Turkey from the side of Hungary and Poland, to support Fez and Morocco against the Turks, to reconquer Philippopolis and Adrianople, and then, after securing Euboea or Chalcedon for a seaport, to crown the enterprise by the seizure of Cairo, Alexandria, and Constantinople. To arrange these matters Cardinal Campeggio was sent to England as legate a latere, and after some doubt whether English law would recognise him in that capacity, was welcomed with much pomp. But papal crusades were not believed in, and neither clergy nor laity would vote money for any such purposes. Thus the progress of the Turks remained unchecked, and the risk was from time to time most imminent that the nations of Europe might be subdued by them. Indeed, though such dangers gradually diminished, they were brought absolutely to an end only by 2 much later events: the great sea fight at Lepanto in 1571, and Prince Eugene's land victory over the Turks at Petrovaradin in 1716. End of Section 12.